sequestering the carbon, activists relating to climate change should love the idea that, I don't think I'm overstating this, I've heard other scientists refer to it. If all the cropland that's now growing these major crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton in the U.S., and especially if you did that around the world, of course we're not going to get 100%, but if it did, we would be taking more carbon out of the air than all the automobiles and diesel trucks could even put into the air.
Hello everyone, I'm Rishi Katz, and welcome to the Oval Table, where we discuss all things related to helping those who live and work within your business how to survive, thrive, avoid pitfalls, have more fun, and become successful faster. Getting advice and input from someone outside of your business can make a big difference, and that's what we seek to do for you each and every week. Here at the Oval Table, we believe that every voice matters, and we want to model how that works. Often the advice that makes the difference comes from where you least expect it. We seek every week to provide a lens for a different way to do business. So much more is possible when everyone's ideas make it to the table. Let me introduce you to our co-hosts, Vaughn Johnson, Doug Bowers, and Carl Walsh.
We have with us today Randall Reeder, who is an expert in regenerative agriculture, which I think many people believe is the healthy future for agriculture around the world. And he is a member of the Soil and Water Conservation Society, Farm Bureau, and the National Speakers Association. For 32 years, Randall was on the faculty at Ohio State University as an extension agricultural engineer, and they have a pretty good football team this year as well. Currently, he serves as the executive director of the Ohio No-Till Council and organizes programs for the Conservation Tillage Conference. He gives a lot of talks to businesses and organizations all across the country with his second love as the great humorist and political wit, Will Rogers. Randall, so glad to have you with us today.
So glad to be with you, Carl and Doug.
I'm going to let Douglas start this interview off because he is an urban agriculturalist and is much more knowledgeable in this subject than I am. So please, Doug, go right ahead.
Well, Randall, good to talk to you. You're in a technical area in which people who've lived and pretty much grown up in cities are not aware of the situation, not aware of the problems, not aware of some of the terms that are used. So I think it would be good if we start laying out a couple of the terms so that as we move through the interview, we'll be all on the same page. What is regenerative agriculture?
Well, regenerative agriculture means that we eliminate tillage as much as possible. Ideally, it would be continuous no-till, sometimes referred to as zero-till. The second component of it is to reduce purchased inputs. The goal is that we don't have to buy as much nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium as we normally do. A way to accomplish that is because, especially the P and the K, the phosphorus and the potassium, a lot of that is stored in the soil already. And by using deep-rooted crops, including deep-rooted cover crops, then we can pull those nutrients from deeper in the soil up into the surface area where it's available for the cash crops, such as corn, soybeans, and wheat.
Some farmers, when they're using regenerative agriculture, they're including animals in the rotation, and some are not. Can you explain the difference there?
Well, it's ideal to have livestock because if you have cattle that are grazing the corn stalks after corn harvest, for example, or grazing a cover crop that might be planted after wheat harvest, which would normally occur in early July here in the Midwest, then by grazing cattle, you're recycling manure, to be blunt about it. The livestock are going to distribute the nutrients right back onto the ground, and of course they're going to eat the corn and other crops or hay. So it's adding the livestock improves the system, but it's not an absolute requirement because in many cases a lot of grain farmers don't really have a convenient economical way to include livestock.
We should probably also describe the size of farms. Some of these, the farms, the corn and soybean farms are quite large actually. And some of them are on rented ground and not all the pieces are contiguous. So for some, it might be difficult to do the rotational grazing, but on other farms where it's a contiguous piece and it's much easier to do rotational grazing. Can you describe that kind of situation that farmers are facing?
Number one, you mentioned rented ground. About half of the ground in the Midwest is actually rented. So it's farmed by somebody other than the owner. And quite often, the owner, being blunt about it, is a widow of a farmer or just a retired farm couple that want to rent the land out to another neighboring farmer. And you're right, many of these fields are spread around. So the person doing the farming might be farming 2,000 acres, and they might be spread among 15 different fields, possibly as far away as 5 miles from extremes. The thing about rotational grazing, to answer that specifically, I thought of this last night. Think of, small scale, something everybody's familiar with. We're going to graze on a football field. So a football field, counting the end zones, is 110 yards long. We're going to graze 10 yards of that at a time. So we'll put a fence all the way around the field, but then we're going to use a divider fence. This is always an electric fence. So that we're going to start out by putting 1 or 2 cows in one end zone, and that's all the space they're going to have. Now, obviously, we're not talking about the grass or turf that's on an actual football field. Let's assume this is actual farm ground with a good alfalfa or clover or orchard grass growing there. And 1 or 2 cows will stay in that 10-yard end zone for a day or maybe 2 until they eat about half of the grass crop that's available. Then we'll move the electric fence. So they next will have between the goal line and the 10-yard line and repeat that process. Then the next day or 2, they'll move down between the 10 and the 20. And you just keep going, in my little example, down the field that way. So after 10 or 12 days, they will cover the whole field. And then you've got to move them to another similar size for another 10 or 12 days, and then to another similar size. So usually after 30 or 40 days, they would be returned to the field that they started in. Now, I'm using football size field in this example, but for a real farmer, they may have 200 cattle, 200 cows, 200 steers that would be in a field that would be several acres restricted for that day or 2, and then the electric fence would be moved. The purpose of this is that you get about twice as much growth by rotational grazing than you would if you just opened the whole thing up and let them have access to the entire field at the same time. So we're getting more production. We can have twice as many animals as we would without rotational grazing.
Demonstrations I've seen of rotational grazing, the electric fence aspect, we should note, does not hurt the animal. It's merely an annoyance. And as an annoyance, rather than being annoyed with the fence, they're thrilled with the grass. And so that's what they're really interested in. And the samples I've seen say that when the farmer comes out there to move the fence, the animals all know we're moving to a better ground. And so they're already lined up, ready to go across. And they're very cooperative with it all because, it helps them. They have a much better thing. The other thing about the electric fence is it has a tendency to keep out predators. And so you have less problems, unless they're able to jump the fence. It kind of keeps them out. It doesn't keep out hawks and chickens, but does other things. It has the labor intensiveness of having to actually come out there and move the fence.
You have to move the fence, but one way of looking at it is that it takes less time to do that than it does to bale hay or make hay and all the equipment required for that. And these farmers who are doing it, unless you've got a lot of trees and rough ground, things in the way, then they're very efficient at it. A four-wheeler, an ATV, four-wheeler set up, and it doesn't take very long to move the posts and move the fence.
What I've seen some of them do is they will set up the new fence, disconnect the old fence, and the cows and the chickens and stuff move over there, and then they'll just take the old fence and move it up road a piece and just keep that kind of thing moving on. So it
That's the way
seems really easy for them.
that's the way it works. And you have to have water. So sometimes they'll have water piped in. Other times it might be a water tank on a trailer that just simply pulled from one field to the next.
I've seen some farmers who have chicken mobiles. The chicken mobile connected to the feed station, connected to the water station, they simply pick it up and move it. And it all moves at once. Of course, the egg mobile in the pasture protects the chickens from hawks and various other things because they have a place that they can hide. And then once they get into the system where they go in the chicken house at night, and then the farmer comes out in the morning, opens it up, the chickens are ready to go, and they're ready to go back in. And it's all beneficial to them, certainly friendlier to them than doing some other things it could do.
That works fine on that small scale for people who have a few chickens. And obviously, what you're describing is you literally move that by hand for every day or two so that they have fresh ground to be on.
One consideration and reason we're interested in your discussion is because of the regenerative agriculture aspect. But most farms are family farms. And they're not small, they're not necessarily small money farms, they're oftentimes high dollar investment operations. But the mechanics of going from the way you used to do things to a new way, a better way, is the same mechanics of taking a corporation or a business that's maybe doing 5 million and moving it to 12 million. The mechanics are largely the same. But your topic is regenerative agriculture, so we want people to understand that it applies to all small businesses. When you look at the small business, when the farmer has to make a decision as to whether he wants to go regenerative or not, what's going through his mind about what's the equation for him?
Let's take what I would call the worst case scenario. That's somebody that's been plowing the ground every year, either with a moldboard plow, which means they're turning the soil over and tilling it 8 inches deep roughly every year. To move from that to continuous no-till means that they're not going to use any tillage equipment anymore. They're going to have a no-till planter. Practically every planter manufactured today qualifies for that. Think of it in this way. A no-till planter could plant corn right through your front yard, right into the sod. It does not need to be freshly tilled ground. So that's one change. They might need to buy a sprayer, although they probably already have one, to apply plant protection equipment to control weeds and insects and disease. There's much less equipment, smaller tractors usually included when we go to the continuous no-till. Another aspect of it, I mentioned the cover crops, that if we have wheat, a typical rotation, for a farmer of 1,000 to 2,000 acres or more, would be growing corn on part of it, soybeans on part of it, and possibly after the soybean harvest, they would plant winter wheat. You plant the wheat in the fall, it grows ideally 5 or 6 inches high, gets good rooting, then it goes dormant up here where we have cold weather and freezing. It goes dormant through the winter, then it greens up the next spring and grows and becomes a mature wheat crop ready to harvest around the 1st of July. In that example, you can see we're going to be harvesting 3 different crops. Wheat in July, usually the soybeans will be harvested first in September, followed by the corn, which many farmers are trying to finish up by about Thanksgiving time. If that helps you out on the transition. So in summary, we're using less equipment with regenerative agriculture because it's based on no-till in contrast to conventional tillage or plowing. It should take less time, less labor, both for the farm owner, the farm family, or hired labor.
What you're saying basically, Randall, is that this new way of farming saves money, saves the soil, basically, to prevent all of the problems that have happened in the past with, and of course, the major event that everyone knows of is the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s. And it's healthier for the consumer. Is that not true?
You can summarize it this way. There's benefits for the environment, as you described it. There's less sediment going into our streams and lakes and fewer chemicals getting into the water supply, or mainly into lakes and streams and rivers. The benefit for the soil, we have healthier soil, and healthier soil is going to produce healthier food. Among the benefits for the consumer, obviously, is the healthier food. A typical crop grown on long-term regenerative farmland is going to have more protein in it, and it may very well taste better too. Doug mentioned the smaller scale. If you've got a garden that you're using with regenerative agriculture, probably the tomatoes and the green beans and potatoes coming off of that are going to taste better than ones that you might buy in the grocery store. Another benefit is there should be lower cost for the food just because the farmers are producing it more efficiently.
So why isn't everybody doing it?
That's like a lot of other questions. It's a change, and people tend to resist change. The farmer may say, I've been using a chisel plow on a disc all along and just don't want to try anything new.
Are there costs and risks involved, though?
Well, as you make the transition, you're transitioning out of one set of machinery quite often to a different set of machinery. Let me describe it this way. If somehow you inherited or got 2,000 acres of prime farmland and there was no machinery involved with it, now all you've got to do is to buy the machinery. It could be used or it could be new, but you don't have to worry about having an old set of equipment that you have to deal with and get rid of in order to have the expense of going to the new.
Are there any government
So-
programs to help farmers make this transition?
Not really, although the USDA is pretty kind to farmers. There's different programs for different purposes, and we would like to see one of those. It's called EQIP, a transition so that there is more money there for regenerative agriculture, for the continuous no-till, and for adding cover crops than what it's often currently used for.
It strikes me that would be an awfully good use of taxpayer money.
Well, since that's my field, I agree with that. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's a matter of spending $10 million in one category to build long-term manure storages for big dairies, for example. Maybe it'd be better to spend that money on cover crops, subsidize the farmer, because planting, and let me describe cover crops. This is a crop you plant, but you don't harvest it. So there's no direct economic benefit. It's an indirect benefit in that you're improving the soil and also providing nutrients that we bring up from deeper in the soil and saving the cost of fertilizer. If you plant a legume such as a crimson clover, then it takes nitrogen out of the air and you don't have to buy as much nitrogen the next year. So those are benefits of the cover crop. But the direct cost of a cover crop is usually between $25 an acre, maybe $40 an acre. So if the government program, for example, subsidized that at $20 or $25 an acre, then that helps farmers adopt that and keep it going. If a cover crop is planted after wheat, say planted in the middle of July or 1st of August, then it's going to grow for a month to 2 months, and then we can have cattle turned in on that and graze that, especially with the rotational grazing, and they might be able to graze that up until about Christmas time.
So is the problem the farmer has the fear of changing over, or is there so much new to learn and the risk of it all? Is that what's kind of going through the mind there?
Many farmers are already planting no-till, a fairly common situation in a corn-soybean rotation, changing each year, is they will do tillage before the corn, but then they will no-till plant the soybeans the following year. Most of them are already familiar with planting without tillage. But it's the next challenge is to say, all right, you got to get over the fear of planting corn with no-till, so that we're going to do it continuous. And by adding cover crops, that can help make that transition and make a more successful job of planting both crops without tillage.
And to address the bottom line of a small business, are they seeing a financial reward, those that have switched over to this type of agriculture?
Usually for and it'd be sensible for just about any business that's making a significant change in their business operation. There's going to be reduced income probably the first year, 2 years. By the third year, it should be balanced out. And after that, then the cost savings should be a benefit, and you should have the same amount of crop or maybe even more coming off of the farmland. So it's one of those things where, well, I've got to bite the bullet maybe first year or two and just be prepared. But then after that, you're going to have the long-term gains.
Right, and that's just like any small business. In order to succeed on into the future and out to the horizon, you have to take a little bit of hit in the beginning in order to succeed down the line.
Give you a simple example. Let's think about when people were transitioning to actually using a computer instead of doing everything with pencil and paper. You had to buy a computer. So that was a first cost. Of course, nobody's going to argue today that, oh, that was a bad decision. We should never have bought a computer. So it'd be the same thing with regenerative agriculture. You can say, well, it's a challenge. It's going to cost us something to start with. We may have less net income for a while, but then it's going to be better in the long run. And that comes back to government subsidies or payments from other types of programs. Having a government program that's going to pay, using the example of cover crops, pay a few dollars an acre to help for the first 3 years or maybe 5 years so that everything balances out and you've got your soil in good condition and it's going to work better.
Seems to me a much smaller investment than a lot of the environmental programs that we have going at the moment, and this would make perhaps even a larger impact.
Before we leave you here, I wanted to get off into a question that Carl just brought up about environmental impact. One of our co-hosts says that saying virtuous things is not the same as doing virtuous things. And given that we're from California, we hear a lot of virtual statements about we should do this, that, and the other thing to save the environment. We do all kinds of things that help the environment, but it's just a lot of it's talk. What you're bringing up here is a specific do. Protect the environment. It helps the environment. Speak to us for a second about the fact that regenerative agriculture actually helps the environment by storing carbon.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the potential benefits for everybody. As we store carbon in the soil, in soil it's organic matter, and that actually helps retain moisture. So it would take less irrigation, or means that you don't have to depend on rainfall as often as you would otherwise. And sequestering the carbon, activists relating to climate change should love the idea that if we got, and I don't think I'm overstating this, I've heard other scientists refer to it. If all the cropland that's now growing these major crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton in the U.S., and especially if you did that around the world, of course, we're not going to get 100%. But if it did, we would be taking more carbon out of the air than all the automobiles and diesel trucks could even put into the air. So it would really go a long ways toward solving the concerns about increasing temperatures.
So your position then is that if you're really an environmentalist and you really want to remove carbon from the air and improve the soil moisture and improve the soil life, then the program to get behind is regenerative agriculture as opposed to just talk about it.
Do it, yes. And as I say, it's a big benefit to society. I think everybody's going to agree today that it's a good idea to remove more carbon so that we don't have to even be concerned about global warming.
Well, on that note, Randall, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. Again, to our listeners, if you want to contact Randall, you can email him at willrogers@aol.com. You don't have to talk about Will Rogers. Maybe you have questions about regenerative agriculture and how that impacts the food on your plate and the environment which we all live in. Thank you again so much, Randall.
My pleasure.
If you want to save time, save money, and get results faster, listen to the Oval Table and learn from experts who will give you their best advice.
Randall talks about several important points on subjects that people, I think, tend to gloss over and don't realize how important they are. They're not just important for agriculture, but they're also important for the closely held business and I think the society in general. Realize that the vast majority of farms are closely held, and the points that apply to them apply equally to the closely held business. One of the points Randall makes is to focus on regenerative agriculture. That's designed to reduce tillage, reduce fertilizer inputs, keep the soil covered, have less compaction, use cover crops to pull nutrients from deep in the soils up to the surface where current plants can use them. And the benefit of that is less soil erosion, less compaction, less fuel used, higher level of nutrients and soil health. And as a closely held business, you have to do the same thing. You have to manage costs and you have to control your outputs. Another thing I thought was interesting about Randall is that he talks about using animals to manage soil health. When the soil of the Midwest were first put down following the Ice Age, the dominant plant life were grasses and the dominant animal was the buffalo. And this combination built the high quality of soils in the plain states. Randall advocates duplicating that process, but instead with livestock when possible. However, the problem is perhaps twofold. One is farm size. In order for a farm to be equipment cost efficient, you need to operate a large enough farm, which makes running livestock perhaps impractical at times, especially if the fields are not contiguous. If the farm does not have a customer access, then they have livestock with no market, which is similar to making 14.4 modems that are kind of hard to sell. For the closely held business manufacturer, you can be almost anywhere and get labor and facility advantages merely at the cost of freight. But for the farmer, he can't simply do that because he has to be located where he's going to have a market because he doesn't have the ability to transport his materials, which points out that a lot of the Midwestern farms are advocated or focused toward the Mississippi River, which gives them access to foreign trade. A third problem that Randall discusses is the problem we see in many people we have worked with over the past, and that's an unwillingness to change. It is probably a very human emotion. And some consultants have even called the first people to make a change early adopters. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And this is true whether you're a farmer or you own a closely held business in manufacturing or retail sales or wholesale sales. The trick is to figure out which changes to make and how to make them in a cost-effective manner. And this area speaks to our critical factor number 3, of course, which is the need to be an innovator. The last major point Randall makes is regards to the environment. One of the main benefits he points out of regenerative agriculture is the sequestration of carbon out of the air, which has the side benefit of improving the soil health. If you are truly an environmentalist and concerned about the future of life on Earth, then your number one goal is to get the carbon out of the air and back into the soil. Regenerative agriculture is the fastest, the cheapest, the most long-term benefit way of doing that. Talking virtuous is a popular thing to do because it's easy, but being virtuous is something quite different. What did you get out of the interview, Carl?
Well, one of the things that struck me is, first of all, people are reluctant to dive into this because it is risky. And for the first 3 years or so, they're going to take a hit to their bottom line because it takes time to convert over to this particular process of farming. And it seems to me what might speed this process, and what might help a lot, is with all the government programs that we have for agriculture, that we have for green issues. If some of that money was directed towards giving farmers who wish to convert over to this a little incentive and to perhaps in the way of a small business loan, perhaps in the way of grants, however they want to structure it, to help the farmers get through those first 3 or 4 years where they are going to see a reduction in income, and make sure that they're okay, that they can put food on their own tables. That seems to me that would be a great use of our tax dollars. Heck of a lot better than a lot of the things that we spend our tax dollars on. It would be a help to agriculture. Hey, it would be a good green policy as well, taking into consideration everything that you just talked about.
Well, we certainly got a lot out of Randall's interview with us.
You're more the farmer than I am. You're being a urban farmer. I thought he made it all very, very understandable for us city folk. What was really interesting about it is how it ripples through so many different areas. It's just one of those changes that you make that starts affecting everything.
Because I remember what Jolene said, and that is, if you want to eat, you better be concerned about the health of the farmer.
That's right.
We all hope you have a productive and inspirational week. I'm Rishi Katz, and we will see you next time at the Oval Table.